a single grenade, one forgotten soldier, and a battalion of 300 enemy fighters who never saw it coming. The Pentagon classified this story for over 50 years. The man who did it was listed as dead. And the only reason you are hearing it right now is because one retired general broke his silence before he passed away and left behind a handwritten testimony that changed everything we thought we knew about the Korean War. Buckle up, because what you are about to hear is one of the most extraordinary true stories in American military history, and it will leave you questioning everything they ever taught you in school. And before we dive in, if you love your mom and dad, if you appreciate the sacrifices that the people who raised you made so you could sit here today and watch videos like this one, then hit that subscribe button right now and show some love. His name was Corporal James Elijah Rourke, and nobody in the United States Army expected him to amount to anything. He was 22 years old when he enlisted, a rail-thin kid from a dying coal town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, where the winters were brutal and the opportunities were almost non-existent. He had a quiet way about him that made people uncomfortable, not because he was strange or difficult, but because silence in a world full of noise tends to unsettle people who have never learned to sit with themselves. James Rourke had grown up sitting with himself. He had grown up in a house where words were scarce and hard work was the only language that mattered. His father, Earl Rourke, had worked the coal mines for 30 years and had the blackened lungs to prove it. His mother, May, had raised 4 children on a teacher's salary while also tending to a small garden that kept food on the table during the lean months, which were most months. James was the oldest of the 4. He had 2 younger brothers and a sister named Clara, who had been born with a heart defect that required surgery their family could never afford. That was the real reason James Rourke joined the Army. Not patriotism, not adventure, not the posters in the recruiting office showing brave men standing tall against red sunsets. He joined because the military offered health insurance, and health insurance meant Clara could finally get her surgery. He signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in March of 1950, shook the recruiter's hand, and was on a bus to basic training by Friday afternoon. His drill sergeant at Fort Campbell was a decorated World War II veteran named Master Sergeant Harold Briggs, a barrel-chested man from Georgia who had seen combat in the Pacific and believed that the measure of a soldier was not how loud he could shout but how still he could remain under pressure. Briggs noticed something in Rourke almost immediately, something he had only seen in a handful of men across 20 years of military service. When the other recruits were panicking during drills, Rourke was calm. When chaos was manufactured to test their responses, Rourke moved through it like water finding its level. Briggs started calling him Ghost because the kid barely made a sound and seemed to disappear into whatever environment he was placed in. The nickname stuck, and not always as a compliment. Some of the other soldiers read the quietness as weakness. They figured Ghost was the kind of man who would freeze up when things got real. They were wrong. By the time Rourke completed basic training and advanced infantry school, the Korean War had already begun. North Korean forces had crossed the 38th parallel in June of 1950, and the United States was scrambling to respond. Rourke was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division and shipped out to the Korean Peninsula in the early autumn of that year. His unit arrived in a country that felt like the edge of the world, a landscape of jagged mountain ranges, frozen rivers, and villages that had been reduced to ash by weeks of fighting. The cold was unlike anything Rourke had experienced in Tennessee. It was a living, breathing thing that got inside your gear, inside your bones, inside your mind if you let it. Rourke did not let it. He settled into the rhythms of war with the same quiet confidence he had brought to everything else in his life. He was not flashy. He did not tell stories around the fire or brag about his accuracy on the rifle range, even though his accuracy was exceptional. He simply did his job, watched everything, and said little. His squad leader, a sergeant named Danny Kowalski from Chicago, trusted Rourke instinctively. Kowalski was the kind of leader who had learned to read people quickly because his survival depended on it, and what he read in Rourke was a man who would never break. Not under pressure. Not under fire. Not under anything short of death itself. The unit spent the first several weeks pushing northward, engaging in scattered firefights as they advanced through the central mountain corridor. The Chinese had entered the war in October, sending massive waves of soldiers across the Yalu River to reinforce the North Korean forces, and the entire strategic situation had shifted dramatically. What had seemed like a war nearly won suddenly became something far more dangerous. American units that had been advancing found themselves overextended, cut off, and vastly outnumbered. The command structure was struggling to adapt to the new reality, and in that confusion, individual soldiers like Rourke found themselves making decisions that no training manual had fully prepared them for. It was November when everything changed. The date was November 14th, 1950. Rourke's unit, a reinforced rifle squad of 12 men, had been assigned to hold a ridge position overlooking a narrow mountain pass, known to the men simply as the Corridor. The corridor was strategically critical because it was one of the only viable routes through the mountain range for several miles in either direction. Whoever controlled it controlled the movement of forces through that entire section of the front. Command had assured Kowalski that they were holding a defensive position and that reinforcements would arrive within 48 hours. The reinforcements never came. On the morning of November 14th, while a thin gray light was just beginning to separate the sky from the mountains, the scouts reported movement to the north. Not a patrol, not an advance team. A full battalion of Chinese infantry, approximately 300 men, moving in tight formation through the valley below and heading directly toward the corridor. Kowalski got on the radio immediately. Command acknowledged the report. Then there was a long silence. Then a voice came back through the static that said words Kowalski would never forget for the rest of his life. It said, "Sergeant, we cannot get you support in time. Hold as long as you can, and then fall back. Your position is considered compromised." Kowalski stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he looked at his 11 men and said, "We are on our own." What happened in the next 2 hours would become the subject of classified military reports, a retired general's deathbed testimony, and eventually, decades later, a historical investigation that quietly reclassified the event from enemy artillery engagement to single-soldier strategic action. But in those moments on the ridge, none of that mattered. What mattered was the approaching column of enemy soldiers and the 12 Americans who stood between them and an open strategic corridor. The fighting began at exactly 6:14 in the morning. The Chinese battalion had not expected significant resistance at the ridge. Their scouts had likely assessed the position as lightly defended, which it was, and their plan was almost certainly to move through quickly and establish a forward position on the other side of the pass. What they did not account for was the particular combination of terrain, timing, and one extraordinarily perceptive corporal from Tennessee who had spent his entire childhood learning to read landscapes the way other people read books. Rourke had noticed something the previous evening that he had reported to Kowalski almost as an afterthought. Moving through the valley below, he had observed that the Chinese supply and ammunition column was traveling at the center of the formation, flanked on both sides by infantry. It was a standard arrangement designed to protect the supplies from the flanks. What made it vulnerable was the terrain. The corridor narrowed significantly at one point approximately 400 meters below the ridge, a natural choke point where the walls of the pass compressed the valley floor to barely 60 meters across. At that point, the formation would be forced to compress as well. The supply column, the ammunition, the fuel, everything would be squeezed into a tight central mass. Rourke had mentioned this to Kowalski the night before. Kowalski had listened, nodded, and filed it away. When the battalion began its approach that morning and the scale of what they were facing became clear, Kowalski looked at Rourke and said, "That choke point you mentioned.
Talk to me."
Rourke laid it out simply. If the supply column could be hit at the moment of maximum compression, the resulting secondary explosions could create enough chaos to halt the entire advance. The problem was that hitting the column at that point would require someone to get close, very close, far closer than any reasonable reading of the tactical situation would suggest was survivable. The ridge position was defensible from a distance, but getting a man down to within effective grenade range of the pass floor while a battalion was moving through it was not a plan any textbook would endorse. Kowalski looked at the situation. He looked at his men. Then he looked at Rourke. And Rourke was already looking at the choke point. "I need a distraction on the north face," Rourke said. 8 minutes. Give me 8 minutes of fire on the north face to pull their attention upslope, and I can get down to the secondary drainage channel on the eastern wall. From there I have an angle on the center of the pass. Kowalski did the math in his head. The drainage channel Rourke was describing was essentially a shallow cut in the rock face that offered minimal cover and would require Rourke to move approximately 200 meters across exposed terrain under fire while the rest of the squad drew the enemy's attention. If the distraction failed, Rourke would be caught in the open against 300 soldiers. If it worked, he would end up at the bottom of a mountain pass with one grenade, alone, in the middle of an enemy battalion. What do you do when you get there? Kowalski asked. I end it, Rourke said. There was a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then Kowalski said, 8 minutes. Go. What happened next has been pieced together from multiple sources, including Kowalski's own account recorded in 1987 for a military oral history project, the testimony of 3 other surviving squad members, and the deathbed statement of Major General Richard Harmon, who was a young intelligence officer in the region at the time and who received a fragmentary radio report from Kowalski's position during the engagement. The complete picture did not emerge until all of those accounts were placed together, and when they were, what they described was almost impossible to believe. Rourke moved. That was the only word for it. While the rest of the squad opened fire on the northern face of the ridge and drew the attention of the leading elements of the Chinese battalion, Rourke slid down the eastern slope of the ridge through the shallow drainage channel with the speed and silence of a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment his entire life, even if he had never known it. The cold worked in his favor. The frost-covered rock was slippery but relatively quiet, and the noise of the firefight above masked whatever small sounds he made. He moved on his elbows and knees for most of the descent, keeping his profile below the level of the rock walls, navigating by memory because he had studied the terrain the night before the way a surgeon studies anatomy before an operation. He reached the bottom of the drainage channel at the eastern wall of the pass at approximately the 6-minute mark. He had 2 minutes left on the clock Kowalski had given him, and he used them to assess. The battalion was compressed exactly as he had predicted. The choke point had done its job. The supply column was visible in the center of the formation, a series of loaded pack animals and hand-carried ammunition crates moving through the narrowest section of the pass. The soldiers surrounding it were focused upslope, responding to the fire from the ridge above. Nobody was looking at the eastern wall. Rourke pulled the pin. He had one grenade. A single M2 fragmentation grenade with a kill radius of approximately 15 meters and a casualty radius nearly 3 times that. In an open field, it would have been devastating but limited. In the compressed environment of the choke point, aimed at the center of an ammunition column surrounded by enemy soldiers packed tightly together by terrain, it was something else entirely. He rolled it with precision. Not thrown. Rolled. Low and controlled along the base of the eastern wall, angled to carry it directly beneath the first of the ammunition crates. Then he pressed himself flat against the rock and covered his ears. The initial explosion was powerful. But it was the secondary detonations that changed history. The first crate caught, and the blast ignited the one beside it, which detonated and sent shrapnel into a third, which triggered a chain of explosions that moved through the center of the compressed formation like a wave of fire and thunder. Ammunition was cooking off in every direction. Pack animals scattered. Soldiers who had been moving in disciplined formation were suddenly running in all directions with no coherent command structure because the explosion had eliminated both the ammunition supply and several of the key command personnel who had been positioned at the center of the column, as was standard practice for protection. The chaos lasted over 20 minutes. In military terms, 20 minutes of uncontrolled chaos within a battalion formation is catastrophic. Command structure collapses. Unit cohesion dissolves. Individual soldiers revert to survival instinct rather than tactical coordination. The Chinese battalion, 300 men who had been moving with purpose and discipline toward a strategic objective, became 300 individuals trying to survive an attack they could not identify, locate, or quantify. Some moved north. Some moved south. Some attempted to climb the pass walls. In the confusion, Kowalski's squad was able to reposition, and the corridor remained unbroken. The battalion never reformed.
Not that day.
Intelligence reports from the following 48 hours indicated that the unit had been effectively removed from the operational order of battle due to casualties, loss of supplies, and command disruption. An objective that had threatened to collapse an entire section of the American defensive line had been neutralized. And the man responsible for it was, according to the official record, already dead. Here is where the story takes a turn that almost defies comprehension. In the immediate aftermath of the engagement, Kowalski's radio contact with command had been intermittent and fragmented. The report that went up the chain that morning was incomplete, filed under extreme stress, and contained a critical error. Kowalski had reported Rourke as moving into the drainage channel. What command received, through static and confusion, was a report that a soldier had moved into the drainage channel and had not returned. In the chaos of processing a dozen simultaneous engagements across the front, a clerk at the battalion level made a notation that has haunted military record-keeping ever since. Corporal James Elijah Rourke, 7th Infantry Division, was marked as killed in action November 14, 1950. The engagement itself was recorded not as a single soldier action but as an enemy artillery malfunction, a catastrophic accidental detonation within the Chinese formation. It was cleaner. It required less explanation. It fit more neatly into the narrative that command was constructing about the day's events. And because Rourke was listed as dead, there was no living soldier to contradict the official account. Rourke survived. He made his way back up the ridge under cover of the post-explosion confusion and rejoined the remnants of his squad. When Kowalski saw him emerge from the eastern slope, the sergeant reportedly said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I thought you were gone." Rourke reportedly picked up his rifle, checked the chamber, and said, "Not yet." That was the extent of the debrief. In the days that followed, the administrative error was never corrected. The paperwork moved faster than the truth, as it so often does in war. Rourke was officially dead. His file was processed. His personal effects were notified to next of kin. His mother May received a telegram at the small house outside Knoxville. His sister Clara, who had recently had her surgery covered by the military insurance James had obtained when he enlisted, received the news while still recovering in a hospital bed. Rourke, meanwhile, continued to fight. He served with his unit for another 4 months under increasing confusion about his status. Attempts to correct the record were met with bureaucratic walls that proved nearly impossible to scale from the field. At one point, a regimental clerk reportedly told Kowalski that correcting a Kia filing required documentation that could only be processed stateside, and that in the meantime Rourke should continue to perform his duties. Which he did. A dead man fighting a war, drawing no pay, receiving no recognition, and making no complaint about any of it. He was eventually repatriated in the spring of 1951 as part of a unit rotation. The process of officially undoing his death took almost 2 years of paperwork, testimony, and bureaucratic persistence by Kowalski, who had by that point left the army and was working as a postal worker in Chicago, but who refused to stop fighting for the man he had sent down that mountain alone with one grenade. Rourke's death was officially rescinded in 1953, the same year the Korean War armistice was signed. He returned to Knoxville. Clara was healthy. His father's lungs were worse, but he was still working. His mother hugged him for a long time at the bus station and did not say much. Neither did he. They walked home together through the November cold and had dinner at the kitchen table, and James Rourke sat in his father's chair and ate his mother's cooking and said very little about any of it. He went back to work. He found a job at a hardware store. He married a woman named Ruth in 1955, and they had 3 children. He coached Little League for 12 years. He attended church on Sundays. He was, by every external measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary American life. He never sought recognition. He never wrote a memoir. He gave one interview to a local newspaper in 1978 in which he said that the Korean War had been cold and that he was glad it was over. He did not mention the grenade, the choke point, or the battalion. It was Major General Richard Harmon who brought the story to light. Harmon had spent decades in the intelligence community and had always known that the official account of the November 14th engagement was incomplete. He had seen the fragmentary radio report from Kowalski's position. He had seen the intelligence assessment of the Chinese battalion's collapse. He had spent enough years in the military to understand that artillery malfunctions do not produce the specific pattern of damage and behavioral disruption that the reports described. He knew something else had happened in that pass, and he spent years trying to piece it together. He tracked down Kowalski in 1985. The two men sat together for 2 days while Harmon recorded Kowalski's full account. Then Harmon spent the next several years tracking down the other surviving members of the squad, cross-referencing their accounts with Chinese military histories that had begun to become available through academic channels, and assembling a complete picture of what had occurred. By the time he was done, he had a document that ran to over 100 pages and that told, in precise and devastating detail, the story of what one corporal from Tennessee had done on a frozen November morning with one grenade. Harmon submitted the document to the Department of Defense in 1991. He requested a review of Rourke's record and a formal recognition of his actions. The review process moved slowly, as such things do. By the time any formal response was forthcoming, James Rourke had died quietly in his sleep at his home outside Knoxville on a Tuesday morning in March of 1994. He was 66 years old. Ruth was with him. His children were called. His grandchildren came. They buried him in a small cemetery on a hill outside of town, with a military headstone that listed his rank, his dates, and his unit. Nothing more. General Harmon attended the funeral. He stood at the back of the small gathering and said nothing during the service. Afterward, he walked to the grave alone and stood there for a long time in the cold. Then he went home and rewrote the final section of his document, adding a dedication that read, "For James Elijah Rourke, Corporal, United States Army, who stopped a battalion with one grenade and asked for nothing in return." Harmon died in 2002. His document was donated to the National Archives by his family, along with his personal papers and the recordings of his interviews with Kowalski and the surviving squad members. The document sat in the archives for years, accessible but largely unread, filed under a reference number that gave no indication of its contents. It was a graduate student researching Korean War operational history who finally found it in 2019. She had been looking for something else entirely when she pulled the file and began reading. She read through the night. In the morning, she called her dissertation advisor and said she had found something extraordinary. Her subsequent research and publication brought the story to the attention of historians and military analysts who had spent careers studying the Korean War and had never heard of the engagement at the corridor or the corporal who had ended it. The story spread. Veterans organizations picked it up. Military history publications ran long features. Social media did what social media does, carrying the story to corners of the world where nobody had heard of James Rourke or the 7th Infantry Division or a frozen mountain pass in Korea in November of 1950. The Department of Defense conducted its own review and officially updated Rourke's service record to reflect his actions on November 14, 1950. The action at the corridor was formally reclassified from enemy artillery engagement to single-soldier strategic action. There was talk of a posthumous Medal of Honor. That process, as of this telling, remains ongoing. What stands, regardless of what any government ultimately decides to put on a piece of paper, is this. A young man from a coal town in Tennessee, who joined the army to pay for his sister's surgery, who was called Ghost because he was too quiet for people's comfort, who was listed as dead by the country he served, who spent 2 years as a bureaucratic ghost fighting a war his country refused to officially acknowledge he was alive for, who came home and worked at a hardware store and coached Little League and never asked anyone to remember his name. That man changed the course of a battle. Possibly the course of a section of a war, with a single grenade and a clear understanding of how the land lay. He did not do it for glory. He did not do it for recognition. He did it because it needed to be done, and he was the one who could see how to do it. There is a particular kind of courage that history almost never captures. Not the loud kind, not the kind that gets photographed or memorialized in speeches. The quiet kind. The kind that belongs to men and women who simply do what the moment demands and then go home and live their lives as though the extraordinary thing they did was just one more task that needed doing. James Rourke was that kind of man. The world is built by that kind of man and woman, And the debt we owe them is one we will never fully repay. But we can remember, and we can tell the story. Rest easy, Corporal Rourke.
Ghost.
From the kid from Knoxville, who nobody expected anything from, to a man whose name deserves to stand alongside the bravest this country has ever produced. You stopped a battalion with one grenade. And you did it alone, in the cold, for a sister who needed surgery and a country that forgot to notice you were still alive. We notice now. Now tell us something. You just heard one of the most extraordinary stories in American military history, and we want to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city and your state in the comments section right now. Whether you are watching from New York or Nashville, from Texas or Tennessee, from the Pacific Northwest or the Deep South, we want to see this community on the map. Leave your location below because this story belongs to all of us, every corner of this country, and the men and women who gave everything to protect it. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, if it made you think about the quiet heroes in your own life, the people who gave everything and asked for nothing back, then hit that subscribe button right now. Do it for your mom. Do it for your dad. Do it for every person who ever sacrificed something so that you could have a better life. These stories exist because men like James Rourke existed. The least we can do is make sure they are never forgotten. Subscribe, share this video, and we will see you in the next one.